So I'm James Pearce, and I don't get out very much. I spend a huge amount of time on Facebook. And probably some of you spend lots of time on Facebook as well. But social media is a weird place, isn't it? People tend to share lots of carefully angled selfies of themselves or photos of their dinner, and it looks like they're having a really great life, but it's not always an accurate representation of how things really are. But I've actually got a different experience of Facebook. Most of the people I speak to tend to just send me photos of their hands, like a selfie, but with just a hand instead of a face. And I'm not just talking about a few people either. I mean, tens of thousands of people send me photos of their hands over Facebook. And that's not as weird as it sounds. A photo is worth 1,000 words, right? Well, I think that depends on if you know what you're looking at. About 3 years ago, the refugee crisis broke as a big news story, and my Facebook was full of images of what looked like crazy migrants running across motorways, trying to jump on moving lorries with the police trying to control the situation, and it just looked like chaos for everyone involved. But they're the sort of questions that they're the sort of photos that give you more questions than answers, like who would run around on a motorway in front of moving traffic? Why are there so many of them? And why are they doing it right in front of the police? Where did they come from? And at the time, David Cameron described them as a swarm, and I think maybe people do look a bit like insects if you're far enough away and it's just arms and legs scrambling in a mass. But they weren't really that far away. They were close enough that you could, if you wanted to, go and find out a bit more about them. And refugees are such a divisive issue. People tend to be very strongly against helping refugees or very strongly in favour. And I think at the time, I didn't feel a strong sense of compassion, but what I felt was a sense of curiosity about the situation. And in November 2015, two of my friends were organising a trip to the Calais jungle to volunteer, to go and do the usual things that volunteers do out there, distributing shoes and food and clothes and the rest of it. I was prepared to go and sort through some clothes in the warehouse if it meant that I'd get to have a look at the infamous jungle. And I think that's how we all felt at the time. TV had kind of made it that way, that we were more curious than compassionate, and I was kind of more tourist than I was a volunteer. But on the second day when I went to Calais, the chance came up to go into the jungle, to go into the camp, to leave the warehouse, and this was my chance to go and meet refugees close up, like a sort of long-haired Ross Kemp. The problem was that it was actually a really bad time to go to the jungle. People had been arriving there in their thousands that summer, and there just wasn't any resources. I mean, we're talking 3 portaloos between 2,000 people. It was stark. And the other thing is, no one told us that when you go into the Calais jungle, you're supposed to take off your fluorescent yellow jacket that you've been wearing in the warehouse and leave that behind. And so we wandered into the camp with these fluorescent yellow jackets, kind of like a fluorescent lost sheep, I guess. And within about a minute, there was this huge crowd around me of all these people asking me things in languages I didn't understand, frantically tugging on my arm and begging me for things, begging me for a tent, begging me for a blanket. And quickly I realised it was a different scene to the images that I'd been seeing on the news. The people who were asking me for shoes really didn't have any shoes. They were walking around barefoot in the mud in November. And it wasn't just young men like I'd seen on the news. There was children there was women there. There was an elderly man who had only one leg, who led me to show me where he slept, and it turned out to just be a wet pile of rubbish. And if I'm honest, my primary worries before I'd gone to the jungle was I thought it was going to be a lawless place. I thought if migrants were prepared to run across motorways in front of traffic, then maybe they were prepared to do anything. That's kind of what it looked like on the news. But stood there among them with this crowd around me, I sort of realised it wasn't me at risk, it was them who were at risk. I was kind of in shock at this stage. And I think when you're in shock, you're quite malleable. You kind of just want the person next to you to take you by the hand and tell you what to do. And the person next to me was a huge Sudanese man asking me to put a tent up for him in the wind. So I had a go at doing that. The thing about the jungle is if you're ever stood there wondering what to do, you won't be stood there for very long because somebody's going to be grabbing you and saying, please, I need help with this, and you just have to do it. I mean, it's an emergency. And that's what I hadn't really realised prior to going to the jungle. I knew I was going to a migrant camp and I knew I was walking into a crisis of some sort, but I hadn't really considered that I was walking into an emergency situation in the way that if you see an emergency situation, you have to respond to it. You're kind of responsible. Have you ever had one of those situations in life where you have some kind of emergency, but there's just the right stranger there at just the right moment just to help you and to make it better for you? I've always driven really unreliable cars, and I remember a few years ago driving to work and breaking down right in the middle of a busy roundabout, slap bang in the middle of the traffic, middle lane. And my response to that situation was just to get out of my car and start pushing. I just kind of wanted it to be out of the way. And within about 2 seconds, there was these two other guys who had got out of their cars. They'd seen what was going on, and they were pushing as well. And very quickly, we moved my car to the side of the road, and we kind of, so I said thanks, and they went on their way. And just before they went on their way, there was this moment between us that was like a kind of smug look that we shared, like a shared victory, that we were all kind of pleased that we'd managed to get my rubbish old car to the side of the road. There are moments in life, I think, when any of us would help a stranger. There's certain times when it would be more instinctive than it would feel like an inconvenience. If you were in a shop and an elderly person in the queue in front of you, you saw them beginning to stumble, I think it would be instinctive for you to reach your hand out and try and steady them rather than just watching them drop in front of you. Or if you were eating dinner in a restaurant and you saw somebody choking, I think you'd find it difficult to just carry on eating without reacting in some way to what was going on in front of you. If you think of helping people on a scale of priority, and at the top of that, there's these immediate situations that you feel compelled to respond to. Maybe a loved one's in trouble and you just have to drop everything and be there for them. And then at the other end of that scale, there's things which there's no way you're going to help with, no chance. There's a friend who wants to borrow money and they didn't pay you back the last 3 times. Or a cold call from a charity that you're not particularly interested in. And then sometimes there's things that are just so big that it doesn't seem like there's any point in trying to help. Maybe some big news story far away. And then I think there's some stuff that's in the middle. Somewhere, if that is a scale, then there'll be a middle to that scale. Things which you're not really quite decided about. Things which you probably would help with if somebody asked you, but you hadn't really thought about helping with them. I wonder what it takes to move something up and down that scale. If something starts at the bottom, or if it starts in the middle, or if it starts at the top, how you can move it from one place to another. In a professional setting, when you talk about calculating risk, you tend to look at the seriousness of something if it happened, and the likelihood of it happening. And if both of those factors are reasonably high, then you'll take preventative measures to make sure that it doesn't happen. It's why cars are fitted with seat belts, because road accidents really do happen and the consequences of them are quite severe. But if you change those factors around, if you move one of them away, if you take a situation that's very serious but unlikely to happen, like a Godzilla scenario, that would be quite a serious situation. Probably a lot of people would die in that situation, but it's not very likely to happen. And that's why we're not all out practicing big lizard drills just in case. And then you could do it the other way around. You could, something that's very likely to happen but not particularly serious, like how careful are you about losing pens? Maybe you have a nice pen, you're more careful, but we don't take any serious precautions against that happening either. And what if there were similar sums taking place when it comes to working out whether we help strangers or whether we help anybody? You might be prepared to leave a good friend to struggle through something that was quite minor if you were quite busy at the time. Or you might be prepared to leave a complete stranger to struggle through something really quite major, again, if you were quite busy at the time. And helping just one person, that's completely different to helping lots of people or championing a cause. The guys who stopped and helped me push my car to the side of the roundabout weren't interested in the wider plight of people who drive unreliable cars. And they weren't politically motivated to push my car to the side of the roundabout, and they hadn't seen a news report about it. They were just going about their day, and they saw a situation in front of them which instinctively they felt that they needed to respond to. Muhammad, the big Sudanese man tugging my arm in the jungle, had made it to that same place in my list of priorities. We were both stood there next to each other. I'd gone all the way to the jungle, I was there, and he was tugging my arm asking for help. Putting a tent up is not really my forte anyway, but putting a tent up in the wind is even more difficult, and putting a tent up in the wind in the jungle is like 3 times more difficult because the ground is so sandy you can't use tent pegs, so you have to dig the edges of the tent in to stop it blowing away, and everywhere you dig there'd be other broken tents and rusty tin cans and human excrement quite often. And perhaps I think because it was such a difficult thing to do, By the time you've finally put this tent up between the two of us, you've kind of bonded with the person that you were working with. And me and Mohammed had that same kind of look, that shared victory, in the same way that the guys who'd pushed my car had. It wasn't really about who had the broken down car or who was going to be sleeping in the tent tonight. It was just the fact that together we'd managed to overcome this obstacle. It wasn't just Mohammed either. The time I spent in the jungle was full of those kinds of experiences, moving from one place to another, quickly helping somebody as best you could, and bonding with them a little bit at the same time. And I realised that refugees weren't really anything like I thought they'd be, whatever it was I thought they'd be like. Sometimes when you see someone that looks crazy wandering around in the traffic, they might just be a normal person who's having a bit of an emergency and you might need to help them. And I made quite a few trips to the jungle after that, as many as I could. And I made friends there, and we kept in touch on Facebook, as I guess lots of people do, refugees too. And we did what normal people do. We argued about politics, and we argued about religion, and food, and music, and we shared jokes. Like, for example, in England, when we take the mick out of someone for having a huge old mobile phone, we call that a brick, right? Well, in Syria, they call that a shoe, which I thought was quite good. I'd gone from being a passive observer of something that seemed like a huge crisis far away to feeling that I had friends immediately caught up in this. The refugee crisis itself had gone from being something that was far away and unimaginable to a series of close-up, one-to-one encounters with people. And my perception of what refugees are had really changed. They weren't dangerous or mysterious or in any way different to us. They were just funny, annoying, kind, irritating sometimes. They were just normal people. Lots of them were very middle class. And it just made me think maybe this is what the whole world's like. We've got all these cultures, nationalities, religions, and we're divided by borders, but maybe just if you go to any neighborhood in the world, you'd meet the same characters. Maybe the personality types are just peppered across them all at random, and all you'd have to do is just begin mixing with people to find that out. And maybe that's not such a big revelation for anyone who's been outside Norfolk a bit more often than I had, but for me it was kind of a surprise. I couldn't keep going back to Calais. I had a job, and I didn't have all that much money to keep going to France, and I couldn't keep getting the time off work to do it. So I went when I could, and I took what I could to help people. And when I couldn't go, I found out that I could top up my friends' phones online. Some of the people in the Calais jungle were using UK SIM cards in their phones. The phone credit is not something I'd thought about before, but it's hugely important to people in a position of displacement. It gives them back their voice, and it gives them a little bit of control, and it gives them a chance at organising some of their own support networks, and it gives them a chance to speak to their family. Most of all, I think, most importantly, it helps to keep them safe. At the start of February, I had an idea. I chatted to lots of refugees online who'd become my friends, and I thought, what if I made a Facebook group and I added all these refugees who I talked to? There wasn't loads of them. There was only maybe 4 or 5 at the time who I was really friendly with. And I asked my Facebook friends to join the group as well. And together, peer to peer, people could just offer to top their phones up. Just a simple idea, just person to person. I kind of felt like if people had the chance, my friends had the chance to meet refugees person to person in the way that I had, then it might shatter some of their preconceptions about the differences between us in the way that meeting refugees person to person had really changed my perception. People were pretty skeptical. Why refugees? Why phone credit? How could you know you were helping a real refugee over Facebook? And refugees were pretty skeptical too. Why would they help me? How can I trust them? What if it's a trick? But it only takes one. It only takes one stranger in the right place at the right time to make that difference. Now, I knew the first refugee who was asking for phone credit was genuine because I knew him. He was my friend, and I'd seen where he slept in the jungle. I knew that his need was real. And I knew that the first donor who popped up and said, okay, I'll buy that phone credit, I knew they were okay because they were one of my Facebook friends too. Now, the refugee and the person who donated their phone credit didn't know each other, but somehow stretched out between the three of us was just enough trust and just enough of a thread of a connection for it to work. Amidst a global crisis on what felt like the other side of the world, one person had appeared on Facebook and asked for phone credit, and somebody else had said, okay, I'll buy that for you. It wasn't just them either. Once a couple of refugees in the group saw this happen, they thought they'd try their luck as well. So they popped up and said, could I have some phone credit? They wondered if there was anyone there who could help them too. And it turned out there was. Now, it was pretty simple at this stage because I knew the 4 or 5 refugees in the group, and I knew all of the people who were donating phone credit. Everybody knew each other. But it didn't stay that way for very long. Good news tends to travel quite fast, and pretty soon there was other refugees from the Calais jungle appearing in the group and asking us for phone credit. Well, this was crazy, though. You couldn't just have a Facebook group where people turned up at random, said, I'm a refugee and I need phone credit, and then someone would buy it for them. Well, for about a week and a half, you could. But at this point, as we were adding more and more people, as we were trying to keep up with the more and more refugees that were coming into the group, I was asking my friends to add their friends and for them to add their friends and so on, so that the donor pool would keep growing and we could keep pace. And another volunteer joined, a lady called Rianne, who helped me run it to begin with, and she said, it might be more sensible, rather than just letting people turn up and ask for credit, to get them to apply through us. So we could make sure everybody got the same amount, and nobody got credit more than once a month, and that would make sure that everybody had a fair chance. But there was just one complication with this. By taking the position of processing all of the applications, we'd sort of taken on the responsibility for assuring all the people who were donating their money that it was really going to refugees, that these were really genuine people. And we didn't know. We had no idea. They were just people turning up in the Facebook group, just asking for help. And how can you really tell over Facebook, over Messenger, if you're speaking to someone in the Calais jungle, or if you're speaking to Dave in Stevenage who fancies a free top-up? Well, what about if you asked them for some photos? I'd recognise a photo of the jungle if I saw one. But it turns out refugees don't really like sending photos of themselves to strangers over the internet. I had no idea why, but apparently that's not a very good idea. But what about if you asked them to just hold up a picture of their hand outside their tent, outside where they're sleeping? Maybe that would work. I think some of the more clever people in the room will have worked out that this is the plan we went with. But not for long. There were more volunteers, and it's not the only check we do on people. We began introducing other checks soon, so we were checking people's GPS positions, which you can easily do over Facebook Messenger. We were checking their asylum documentation, and we were checking their IMEI codes, which is a unique manufacturing code of every mobile phone, recording their SIM cards and keeping it on a database and making sure that none of the information matched any of the other applicants before we approved them for credit. Soon, more refugees began to volunteer themselves for the group, and suddenly this meant we had translators on our team and people with inside knowledge about the camp. Pretty soon we'd made up picture card instructions so we could extract all the information we needed from people who were asking us for credit. We could check that they were genuine, we could check that they hadn't had credit in the last 30 days, and we could assess just exactly how vulnerable they were and how much of a priority they would be. It's a good job we got this stuff worked out, because within about a month, within 2 months, it wasn't just tens or hundreds that were turning up in the group. As you might imagine, good news travels quite fast among people in desperate need. Pretty soon it was thousands of people turning up in the group asking us for phone credit. And it wasn't just the Calais jungle either, it was people in Belgium, people in Italy, Greece, Turkey. Pretty soon it was spreading across the world. Our group had become a very busy roundabout to break down on. If you're going to break down, don't do it on a side road where no one can see you. Do it slap bang in the middle lane of a busy roundabout where there's loads of traffic. Do it on Facebook. If it's not on Facebook, then it didn't happen. Stories were beginning to find their way back to us too. Some of the people we'd given credit to had managed to contact loved ones who they hadn't spoken to for sometimes a month, 2 months, a year, 5 years sometimes. Everybody told us that they spoke to their mum. Everybody was really thankful for that. And women told us that they felt safer because they could call for help when they needed to. And children had been rescued from danger by summoning help from volunteers. Refugees told us it made them feel human to have phone credit again. It gave them hope. The people we were helping weren't just anonymous figures on a newsreel. They had names, they had stories, and we were hearing those stories in the group. It went on to become a community that we all felt a part of. I went back to Calais one last time in the October, just before they demolished the main camp out there. We knew that people were going to be dispersed all over, possibly all over Europe, and that they would need phone credit to keep them safe and to get their things in order and to take care of themselves. We had business cards made up in all the different languages that were spoken in the jungle, and I went with these business cards to hand them out. And just like that first visit when I went there, I was immediately surrounded by a big crowd of people all kind of begging me in different languages and tugging my arm and asking me things. But something had changed. The people who were tugging on my arm weren't asking me for shoes this time, and they weren't asking me for tents. They were asking me for selfies. They were holding up their hand and pretending to take a photo of it and laughing at me and grinning and smiling. When we gave refugees the chance to connect to the outside world, we didn't just give them back services, and we didn't just give them the chance to organise some of their own aid, and we didn't just connect them to their families, we connected them to ourselves. We'd formed a community which all of us felt a part of, and that community was made up of people from the Calais jungle, from America, from France, from England, from all over. And I think we all learned that something we hadn't really felt, that a lot of people say, that restored my faith in humanity, as if faith in humanity is kind of lost. But I think people are instinctively very decent. I think people will help each other as long as they can make some kind of connection. And if they can see the good they're doing right in front of them, then they usually do it. Technology that we have in the palm of our hands now makes it possible to connect across borders, across cultures. It makes it completely possible. And the need for a more connected world, I think, makes it essential. Today I want to make more connections with all of you. I believe that a lot of the problems in the world are born of disconnection. I think some of the things that are happening to people far away, if they were happening to somebody we knew, then we wouldn't allow them to happen. I hope that all of you, or as many of you as possible, will come and be a part of our community and help us to make it into something bigger. Thank you.